The air in the big house was thick with happy sounds. It was a kind of laughter that was easy and loose, the kind that comes from people who don't have to worry about much. Glasses chimed together like tiny happy bells, and a low, steady murmur of conversation filled the spaces between the notes of soft music playing from hidden speakers. The smell was a mix of expensive perfume and the tasty, warm scent of little snacks being carried around on silver trays by people in crisp, black and white uniforms. It was a world of shining lights and bright colors. It's a world that felt a million miles away from the quiet, dusty street outside. And in the middle of it all, but not really a part of it at all, was a girl. She was 12 years old, and her name was Alara. She had perfected a special kind of magic. The magic of becoming invisible. She sat on a fancy carved wooden bench tucked away in a corner of the grand hallway, a spot where the light from the big chandelier didn't quite reach. Her dress was a simple, faded blue one, worn soft from many washes, and her shoes were scuffed at the toes. She had learned long ago that if you kept your head down, if you made yourself small and quiet, people's eyes would just slide right over you. You become part of the wall, a piece of furniture they don't notice. She watched the river of people flow past her, a sea of silky dresses and dark, well-fitted suits. They were all so bright, their jewelry catching the light, their faces animated with stories she couldn't hear. Ilara was there because her mother Maria was working. Maria was one of the people in the crisp black and white uniform. But instead of carrying trays, she carried a feather duster and a cleaning cloth. Tonight was a big party for the family who owned the house, which meant extra work. It was late, and instead of making Alara walk home alone in the dark, her mother had told her to wait quietly on the bench. "Just read your book, mi amor," she had whispered earlier, her hand warm on Alara's shoulder. "And don't talk to anyone. Just be a little mouse." Lara was good at being a little mouse. She had her book open on her lap, but she hadn't turned a page in an hour. She was too busy watching. She watched a woman with a huge, sparkling necklace laugh so hard she had to hold on to a man's arm for support. She saw a man with a very serious face tell a story, gesturing with a glass of dark red liquid. Everyone leaned in, listening carefully. Alara wondered what they were talking about. Was it about their trips to faraway places? Or about the new cars they drove? Their lives seemed so full, so easy. Her own life was made up of smaller things. The sound of her mother's key in the lock at the end of a long day. The taste of warm bread from the corner shop. The feeling of sun on her face on the walk to school. These things were good, but they were quiet. This world was loud. Every now and then her mother would walk by. Maria moved with a quiet efficiency, her eyes always scanning for a smudge on a glass or a crumb on the floor. She would glance over at Alara, a quick, silent check-in. Her eyes would say, "Are you okay?" And Alara would give a tiny, almost invisible nod back. "I'm okay." It was their secret language. A language built in a world where they had to be careful, where they had to work hard to be seen as little as possible. Seeing her mother's tired face made Alara sit up a little straighter. She had a job to do, too. Be invisible. Don't cause any trouble. To make her mother proud. But there was one thing in this big, shiny house that made it very hard to be invisible. It was sitting right in the middle of the grand hallway, like a king on its throne. It was a grand piano, black and polished so brightly it looked like a pool of dark water. It reflected the chandelier, and the lights, and the faces of the people walking by. But from her corner, Alara couldn't see herself in its shine. To her, it wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a living thing, a beautiful beast sleeping. She imagined it held all the songs in the world inside it, trapped under its heavy lid, just waiting for someone to let them out. She had seen pianos before, in school or in shop windows, but never one like this. This one looked important. Its legs were carved like the claws of a giant animal, and the white keys looked like perfect, clean teeth. Ilara felt a pull towards it, a strange and strong feeling in her chest. It was like a magnet. She wondered what it would feel like to run her fingers over those keys. She imagined they would be cool and smooth. She imagined the sounds they could make, not just the simple notes she had learned in music class, but big booming sounds that could fill the whole room, and soft whispering sounds that could make everyone hold their breath. She knew the rules. Her mother's voice was in her head. "We don't touch their things, Alara. We are here to clean, not to play." But looking at the piano, she felt something else, a feeling that was bigger than the rules. It was a feeling of deep, aching curiosity. It was the same feeling she got when she looked at the stars in the night sky. A feeling of wonder and a desire to touch something so beautiful and far away. The people at the party walked past the piano without a second glance. To them, it was just another expensive object in a house full of expensive objects. But to Alara, it was a mystery. It was a promise. It was the most interesting thing in a room full of people who thought they were the most interesting things. And as she sat there, in her quiet corner, the whole world seemed to fade away, leaving only her and the silent, sleeping piano waiting. The party kept swirling around her, a bright, noisy river that she was not a part of. Time seemed to stretch and warp. An hour could feel like a minute, or a minute could feel like an hour. Alara's world had shrunk to the size of that polished black piano. She watched the way the light from the chandelier danced on its surface, making little stars that shimmered and vanished. She imagined the strings inside, hundreds of them, stretched tight and silent, each one holding a different feeling, a different story. She thought that if you listened closely enough, you could almost hear them humming with a secret music, a song that was waiting for the right hands to set it free. Her mother passed by again, this time with a small bag of trash in her hand. She gave Alara a quick, tired smile, but her eyes were busy, scanning the room for the next thing that needed to be done. Alara smiled back, a small, tight smile that she hoped looked reassuring. She felt a little pang of guilt. Her mother was working so hard, and here she was, dreaming about a piano. She should be reading her book. She should be thinking about her homework. But the book on her lap was just a block of paper and ink, and the piano was alive. Then, something changed. The soft music that had been playing from the speakers stopped. The little band that had been playing in the corner, a man with a guitar and a woman with a violin, packed up their instruments and took a break. Suddenly, the big room felt different. The low murmur of conversation seemed louder without a melody to hold it. There was a gap, an empty space in the air. It was in that exact moment, that little pocket of quiet, that the pull towards the piano became too strong to fight. It was no longer a thought. It was a feeling, a physical tug in her chest, like a string tied to her sternum. Pulling her forward, her heart started to beat a little faster, a heavy drum against her ribs. "Don't do it," a voice in her head said. It sounded just like her mother. "You'll get in trouble. You'll get me in trouble." But another voice, a quieter one, whispered, "What if? What if it's just one touch? No one will even know. They're all busy." She looked around. The people were in their own little groups, laughing and talking. The servers were busy clearing empty glasses. No one was looking at her. She was still invisible. Taking a deep breath, she stood up. Her legs felt shaky as if she hadn't used them in a long time. She smoothed down her simple dress, a nervous habit. She took a step and then another. The few feet from the bench to the piano felt like the longest walk she had ever taken. The marble floor was cold and hard under her thin shoes, and each step made a tiny, soft squeak that sounded like a shout to her. She was sure everyone would turn and look, but no one did. She was a ghost moving through their world. She stopped in front of the piano. Up close, it was even more magnificent. She could see her own faint reflection in the black lacquer, a small, blurry girl with wide, scared eyes. She could smell the faint, woody scent of old wood and polish. She lifted her hand, her fingers trembling slightly. She just wanted to feel the cool, smooth ivory of the keys. Just for a second. That's all. Her hand hovered over the keyboard, a shadow over the white and black rectangles. She could feel the warmth radiating from the piano, as if it were a living creature that had been sleeping and was now starting to wake up. Her mother's face flashed in her mind. Her tired eyes, her worried smile. Alara's hand started to pull back, but then she looked at the keys again. They were so perfect, so full of promise. It was like standing on the edge of a diving board, looking down into a deep, clear pool. The fear was there, but the desire to jump was stronger. She thought about the quiet of her own home, the small room she shared with her mother. She thought about the sounds of the street outside, the cars, and the shouting. And then she thought about the sound this beautiful thing could make. A sound that was pure and clean and strong. Her finger, just one, moved forward again. It was the index finger of her right hand. It was a decision made not by her brain, but by her heart. She didn't press down hard. She just let the weight of her finger rest on the key. There was a soft click, and then the sound happened. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a single, clear note that rang out in the quiet space. It was a sound that was completely different from the chatter and the clinking glasses. It was pure, like a drop of water falling into a still pond. It hung in the air for a moment, shimmering and perfect, cutting through everything else. It was a sound that said, "I am here." For a second, the world seemed to stop. A man who was telling a story paused, a confused look on his face. A woman turned her head, her eyes scanning the room for the source of the sound. But then the band started tuning their instruments again, a few random notes plucked on a guitar, and the spell was broken. The man went back to his story, a little less enthusiastically. The woman shrugged and turned back to her friend. The moment was over. They had heard the sound, but they hadn't really listened. To them, it was just a strange noise, a mistake in the background of their important evening. But one person had listened. Across the room, standing near the big fireplace, was an older woman. Her hair was an elegant silver, and she wore a dark green dress that was simple but looked very expensive. She wasn't laughing or talking loudly like the others. She was just watching, her eyes sharp and intelligent, taking everything in. When the note sounded, her head turned, not with confusion, but with a sudden, sharp interest. Her eyes found Alara immediately. She saw the girl standing by the piano, her hand still hovering over the keys, her body frozen with a mix of fear and wonder. The older woman saw everything. She saw the girl's simple dress. She saw the way she held herself, small and unsure. But she also saw the look in the girl's eyes as she stared at the piano. It wasn't the look of a child who was just being naughty. It was the look of an artist who had just found her canvas. The woman saw not the cleaner's daughter, but a child who had a deep, unspoken connection to the music that was sleeping in that beautiful black beast. The single note had not been an accident. It had been a question, and in that moment the woman decided she wanted to know the answer. She took a step, her eyes never leaving the girl by the piano. The single note hung in the air for a moment, a perfect, clear sound that seemed to have a life of its own. Then, just as quickly as it was born, it was swallowed by the noise of the party. But for Ilara, the world had changed. The sound was still echoing inside her head, a beautiful, terrible mistake. The magic spell of being invisible was broken. She could feel eyes on her now, not the whole room, but enough. A hot, prickly feeling crawled up her neck. Her feet felt glued to the marble floor. She wanted to run back to her safe corner, to disappear into the shadows again, but her legs wouldn't move. She was a statue, frozen in the act of her crime. Across the room, her mother, Maria, saw everything. She was wiping down a small table near the fireplace. Her movements automatic, her mind on the list of chores she still had to do. But when the note sounded, her hand stopped mid-wipe. Her head snapped up, and her eyes found her daughter standing by the piano, her hand still hovering over the keys. Maria's heart felt like it dropped into her stomach. A cold wave of fear washed over her. She saw the older woman, the one who owned the house, the one who paid her wages, turn her head with a look that was not anger, but something else, something sharp and focused. And Maria knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was very, very bad. This was the kind of trouble that could get her fired. The kind of trouble that could mean they wouldn't have enough money for rent, for food, for the small, important things that held their life together, forgetting everything else, the half-clean table. The guests, her job Maria, started to move. She walked quickly, her steps quiet but urgent, weaving through the clusters of people. She murmured, "Excuse me and pardon me," but her voice was a distant buzz in her own ears. All she could see was her daughter, small and vulnerable, standing in front of the powerful woman who held their future in her hands. It was like a scene from a nightmare, playing out in slow motion. The closer she got, the more her heart pounded. She could see the fear in Alara's posture, the way her shoulders were hunched up to her ears. She had to get there. She had to fix this. She finally reached them and immediately stepped between Alara and the older woman, creating a human shield with her own body. She grabbed Alara's arm and pulled her back gently but firmly. "I am so sorry," she began, her voice trembling. The words tumbled out of her, a desperate, panicked rush. So sorry, madam. She doesn't understand. It was just curiosity. It will never, ever happen again." She kept her head bowed, not daring to meet the woman's eyes. She was a servant, and this was her place, apologetic and invisible. She could feel the eyes of the nearby guests on them, and she felt a deep, burning shame. This was exactly what she had always feared, but the most surprising thing happened. The older woman didn't even look at her. It was as if Maria wasn't there, as if her voice was just the wind. The woman's gaze was fixed on Alara, who was now hiding behind her mother's back, peering out with wide, terrified eyes. The woman's face was not angry. It was calm, and her eyes were filled with a soft, intense light that Maria couldn't understand. She took another step closer, completely ignoring Maria's frantic apologies. The silence that fell over their small group was heavy and awkward. The guests nearby had stopped talking to watch this strange interaction between the lady of the house and the cleaner's daughter. Finally, the older woman spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady, cutting through Maria's panicked whispers like a sharp knife. "Do you play?" she asked. She wasn't asking Maria. She was looking directly at Alara. The question was so simple, so unexpected, that it caught everyone off guard. Alara just shook her head, a tiny, quick movement. She pressed her face into her mother's back, trying to disappear. Maria wanted to scream, "No, of course she doesn't play. We don't have things like pianos." But she was frozen, silenced by the sheer strangeness of the moment. The older woman didn't seem discouraged by Alara's silence. She took another small step, her expensive shoes making no sound on the marble. "I heard that note," she said, her voice a little softer now, a little warmer. It wasn't just a sound. It had a voice. It felt important. She paused, letting the words sink in. Maria felt a confusion that was almost as strong as her fear. This was not the scolding she had expected. This was something else entirely. The woman was looking at her daughter not as a nuisance, but as a person. A real person. Then the older woman did something that made Maria's breath catch in her throat. She looked from Alara to Maria, and for the first time, she acknowledged her presence. But there was no anger in her eyes. There was only a gentle, questioning look. It was as if she was asking for permission. Maria didn't know what to do. Every instinct screamed at her to grab Alara and run, to get out of this house and never come back. But there was something in the woman's gaze, a kindness that was so out of place in this world of shiny things and cold stares, that made her hesitate. The woman turned her attention back to the frightened girl hiding behind the uniform. "Please," she said, and the word was so gentle, so full of respect, that it was more shocking than any command could have been. "Show me." In that moment, something shifted inside Maria. She looked down at the top of her daughter's head, at the dark, tangled hair. She thought about the way Alara would hum to herself when she was doing her homework. Little made-up tunes that were surprisingly beautiful. She thought about how Alara would tap her fingers on the table, always in a rhythm, as if she had music inside her that was trying to get out. She had always seen it as just a quirk, a silly habit. But what if it was more than that? What if this woman, this stranger from a different world, saw something in her daughter that she, in her worry and tiredness, had never truly allowed herself to see? It was a huge risk. It could go so wrong. But for the first time all night, Maria felt a tiny spark of something other than fear. It was a flicker of hope. She looked at her daughter, and she gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. It was a small movement, a slight tilt of her head, but it was everything. It was permission. It was a leap of faith. Feeling her mother's silent consent, Alara slowly unpeeled herself from her mother's back. She was still scared. Her heart was still beating like a trapped bird. But the cold fear was now mixed with a new warm feeling. It was the feeling of being seen, truly seen. Not as the cleaner's daughter, not as a piece of the furniture, but as a girl who had played a note that had a voice. She took a shaky breath and looked at the older woman, who smiled back at her, a real, warm smile that reached her eyes. The room was still watching. The silence was still heavy, but it felt different now. It wasn't the silence of judgment anymore. It was the silence of anticipation. The tiny nod from her mother was the only thing Alara needed. It was a small, almost invisible movement, but to her, it was like a door being unlocked. She took a shaky breath, the air feeling thick and heavy in her lungs. The walk back to the piano was even harder than the first time. Before, she was invisible. Now, every eye in that part of the room was on her. She could feel their gazes like a physical weight, a warm pressure on her skin. She kept her eyes down, watching her own worn shoes take one step after another on the cold, shiny floor. She was not walking towards a punishment. She was walking towards a mystery, challenge she didn't understand, but knew she had to accept. She reached the bench and paused. Her hands were trembling, so she hid them in the folds of her simple dress for a moment, trying to still them. She looked at the piano, no longer as a beautiful, scary beast, but as a friend who had spoken up for her. She carefully lifted the lid that covered the keys, revealing the perfect rows of black and white. It was like opening a treasure chest. Then she sat down. The velvet of the bench was soft and cool against her legs. It felt strange and wonderful to be sitting there in the middle of everything, instead of tucked away in a corner. She felt the solidness of the piano in front of her, a protective wall. For the first time that night, she didn't feel small. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Her hands hovered over the keys, just like before. But this time it was different. It wasn't a hesitant, fearful touch. It was a conversation. Her fingers seemed to remember things they had never been taught. She didn't know any real songs, not the kind you would learn from a book. The music she had was all inside her, a collection of feelings and sounds she had been gathering her whole life. She closed her eyes for a second, blocking out the faces, the lights, the big scary room. She just listened to the quiet space inside her own head. And then her fingers began to move. The first few notes were soft and slow, like a question being asked in a whisper. They were simple, clean, and full of a gentle sadness. It was the sound of waiting, of watching the world go by from a window. It was the sound of her quiet corner, the sound of her mother's tired sighs at the end of the day. A few people in the room shifted, maybe expecting a simple child's tune. But this was different. There was a story in these notes. The melody began to grow, a little more confident now. It started to climb, the notes getting a little louder, a little faster. It was like a bird learning to fly, hopping from branch to branch before taking a big leap. The sound was still lonely, but now it had a spark of hope in it. It was the sound of finding a beautiful book in the library, the sound of the first warm day after a long winter. The room was getting quieter. The low murmur of conversation had faded completely. The clinking of glasses had stopped. People were turning away from their own little groups, their faces drawn towards the sound of the piano. They were no longer just looking at the girl. They were listening. Maria stood a few feet away, her heart still a frantic drum, but now the rhythm was changing. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was being joined by something else. Something warm and bright and overwhelming. She was listening to the music, and she recognized it. It was the little tune Alara would hum while she was stirring the soup. It was the rhythm she would tap on the table when she was thinking hard about her homework. It was all the little bits of music that Maria had heard, but never truly heard, not like this. She saw her daughter's back, her small shoulders straight and strong, and a tear rolled down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or fear, but a tear of pure, breathtaking wonder. This was her daughter, her quiet, invisible little girl. And she had this entire world inside her. The music swelled suddenly, a rush of notes like a sudden rainstorm on a tin roof. It was loud and passionate and full of a longing so deep it made some of the guests catch their breath. It was the sound of wanting something you can't have, the sound of dreams that are too big for the room you live in. It was the sound of looking at a grand piano and knowing you have to touch it, even if you're not allowed. A man with a very serious face, who had looked bored all night, suddenly leaned forward. his elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on the girl's hands. A woman who had been admiring her own sparkling bracelet in the light. Let her hand fall to her lap, her forgotten jewelry suddenly meaningless. The music was speaking a language that everyone in the room understood, even though they had never heard it before. It was the language of the heart. Then, as quickly as it had stormed, the music softened again. The melody became gentle, like a lullaby. It was the sound of forgiveness, of understanding. It was the sound of a mother's hand on your shoulder. It was the sound of finding peace. Ilara's fingers moved with a grace that seemed impossible for a girl who had never had a lesson. They danced across the keys, telling a story that was hers and hers alone, but that felt like it belonged to everyone. She wasn't thinking about the notes or what came next. She was just feeling. She was pouring all the quiet moments, all the secret wishes, all the love and fear and hope she had ever felt into the music. The matriarch. The older woman who had started it all stood perfectly still. A small, knowing smile was on her lips. She wasn't looking at the guests or at their reactions. Her eyes were closed, and she was just listening. She had heard that single note and had known it was a voice. Now she was hearing the whole story, and it was more beautiful than she could have imagined. She had opened a door, and a whole new world had walked out. Finally, the melody began to fade. The notes became slower and softer, like an echo disappearing down a long hallway. Ilara played one last single note, letting it hang in the air, pure and clear and full of a quiet, aching beauty. And then there was silence. It wasn't the awkward silence of before. This was a heavy, sacred silence. The room was holding its breath, the last note of the music still vibrating in the air, in their hearts, in their bones. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, lost in the world the girl had created for them. It was as if they had all been on a journey and had just arrived back, changed. Ilara's hands rested on the keys, her head still bowed. The silence stretched on for what felt like a lifetime, a beautiful, fragile moment where nothing else existed. And then someone started to clap. It was the matriarch. Her clap was not loud or showy. It was a single, firm sound of appreciation. It was a key turning in a lock. And then another person joined in. And another. Soon, the whole room erupted in a sound that was nothing like the polite bored clapping from before. This was a wave of genuine, heartfelt applause. It was loud and strong and full of emotion. It was the sound of people who had been truly moved, who had witnessed something real and rare and wonderful. It was the sound of a room full of people who had almost ignored a girl, but were now on their feet, cheering for her with all their hearts. The sound that crashed over her was not a wave, but a storm. The applause started with the matriarch's single, confident clap, but it was quickly picked up by others. It's growing louder and stronger until it filled the grand hall like a physical force. It was a roar of appreciation, a sound so full of warmth and surprise that it felt like it could lift the ceiling off the house. For Ilara, who had spent her life trying to be quiet, trying to make no sound at all, the noise was overwhelming. It was a good noise, a happy noise, but it was still a wall of sound coming directly at her. Her hands, which had been so sure on the keys just moments before, began to tremble again. She pulled them back and tucked them into her lap, shrinking down on the velvet bench as if she could make herself small enough to disappear. Her first instinct was to run. She wanted to jump off the bench, push past all the staring, smiling faces, and find her mother. She wanted to hide behind her mother's uniform and pretend this never happened. But her feet felt stuck to the floor, and her legs felt like they were made of jelly. She just sat there, her head bowed, her face hot with a blush that spread all the way to her ears. She could see the people out of the corner of her eye. Some of them were even standing up. They were clapping for her. The thought was so big and so strange that her mind couldn't quite hold on to it. Then she saw her mother pushing through the crowd. Maria's face was a mess of emotions. There were tears streaming down her cheeks, but she was smiling a smile so wide it looked like it might break her face. She reached the piano and didn't say a word. She just wrapped her arms around Ilara's shoulders, pulling her into a tight, fierce hug. Ilara buried her face in her mother's side, breathing in the familiar. clean smell of her uniform mixed with the faint scent of the cleaning supplies she used. In her mother's arms, the roaring applause seemed to fade into the background. Muffled by the solid, real feeling of her mother's love, this was her safe harbor. This was what she understood. Her mother was whispering something in her ear, over and over again. Mihaja, Mihaja, my girl, my beautiful girl. The applause began to die down as people saw the quiet, emotional reunion between mother and daughter. The room settled back into a gentle hum, but it was a different kind of hum now. It was a hum of shared experience, of a story that had just been told and heard by everyone. And then the matriarch was there, standing beside them. She waited patiently until Maria pulled back, her hands still resting on Alara's shoulders. The older woman looked at Maria first. Her eyes were full of a deep respect that took Maria by surprise. "You have a very special daughter," she said, her voice quiet but clear enough for them to hear over the remaining noise. That was not just a child playing. That was a gift. A real, true gift. She then looked down at Alara, who was peeking out from behind her mother. A gift that should not be hidden in the corner. It should be shared. Maria didn't know what to say. She just nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Thank you, madam," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She just likes to make up little tunes." "Those are not little tunes," the matriarch said gently. "Those are stories. And she needs to learn how to tell them properly." She paused, her gaze thoughtful. "A gift like this needs a teacher. A good one." She looked from Alara to Maria and back again. "I would like to help. I know a man, a wonderful teacher. He used to play in big concert halls all over the world. He's retired now, but he still teaches a few students. I think he would be very happy to meet your daughter." Maria's heart fluttered. A teacher? A real teacher? The idea was wonderful, but it was also terrifying. It was a world she knew nothing about, a world that costs money. "Oh, we couldn't," she stammered, shaking her head. "It's very kind of you, but we don't have." The matriarch held up a hand, stopping her gently. "It would be my pleasure," she said. "And don't worry about the instrument. There is a community center not far from here. They have a music room with a piano that no one hardly uses. I will make a call. I will arrange everything." Ow. She was not asking. She was stating a fact, but she did it with such kindness that it felt like an offer, not a command. She looked at Alara again. "Would you like that, child? To learn how to make your stories even more beautiful?" Alara looked up at the kind, older woman, and then at her mother, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and hope. She thought about the feeling of her fingers on the keys, the way the music had flowed out of her as if it had been waiting for a long, long time. She thought about the quiet of her own home, and then she thought about the sound of a new story waiting to be told. She took a deep breath and gave a small, shy nod. In the days that followed, it felt like Alara was walking in a dream. The matriarch was true to her word. Phone calls were made. Arrangements were put in place. A week later, Maria and Alara found themselves standing in front of a plain brick building. It was the community center. It wasn't fancy like the mansion. It was simple and clean, and it smelled of floor wax and chalk dust. The matriarch met them there and led them to a small room in the back. Inside, sitting by a window, was an old man with a kind face and tufts of white hair around his ears. And in the corner of the room stood an upright piano. It wasn't black and shiny like the one at the mansion. It was a little faded, a little worn, and when the old man opened the lid, Alara could see that some of the ivory keys were a little yellowed. But to her, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was hers. The final scene takes place a month later. The afternoon sun streams through the window of the small music room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Alara is seated at the upright piano. Her back is straight, and her hands, no longer trembling, move with a new confidence across the keys. She is playing a piece her teacher gave her, a simple melody. But she is playing it with a feeling that makes it sound complex and full of life. Her fingers are learning the language of the piano, and they are becoming fast friends. Sitting on a simple wooden chair against the wall is her mother, Maria. She is no longer in her crisp cleaning uniform. She is wearing a simple dress, and her hands are resting calmly in her lap. She is watching her daughter, and a quiet, happy tear rolls down her cheek. She is not just the cleaner's daughter, and Maria is not just a cleaner in the background. They are a mother and a daughter, standing at the beginning of a new song. Ilara is still the same girl from the quiet corner, but she is no longer invisible. She had touched a piano, and in doing so, had finally been seen. And the music she was learning was only just beginning.